Alien warrior lost her legs and was left for dead. Only the human marine stayed. HFY Sci-Fi story. Hello everyone. Before we begin today's story, I have a small favor to ask. Please hit subscribe and turn on the notification bell so you never miss our channel's new videos. It's quick, free, and the best way to support us in bringing you more dramatic stories. Your support means the world to us. Where are you watching from? Drop your city or country in the comments below. Thank you very much. Now, let's dive into today's story. In the cold, vast expanse of a war-torn alien planet, one man's decision would change the fate of an alien warrior forever. The battle raged on above the clouds, a never-ending storm of fire and chaos. But down on the ground, Sergeant Lucas Stone was far from the action. He had been separated from his unit after a brutal assault, his communications down, his gear barely functional. His mind was focused solely on survival. The air smelled of burnt metal and scorched earth as Lucas trudged through the wreckage of a once thriving settlement. The ground was littered with debris, and the eerie silence of the post-battle landscape was broken only by the distant hum of overhead drones still searching for survivors. Lucas's boots crunched on the rocky ground as he navigated the wreckage, his body weary from days of combat. His armor, once pristine, was now scuffed and scratched, a testament to the harsh conditions he'd endured. As he moved cautiously through the devastation, his eyes scanned for any sign of movement. The sudden rustle of metal caught his attention, and his hand instinctively gripped the rifle slung across his back. He moved toward the sound, wary of what might be waiting for him. Then he saw her, a massive figure, unlike anything he'd ever seen. The alien warrior lay sprawled across the cracked earth, her body twisted in unnatural angles. Her limbs were contorted, her breathing shallow, and her once glistening skin now pale and bloodied. Her legs were gone, ripped away by the explosion that had decimated the area. Lucas's heart raced. She was alive, barely, but alive. He could feel the heat of her blood on the wind, the unmistakable scent of death looming. Despite her alien features, there was something deeply human about her vulnerability. She wasn't an enemy now. She was just another soul stranded in the aftermath of war. Cautiously, Lucas approached, kneeling beside the warrior. Her eyes flickered open, a fiery yellow hue staring up at him. She looked at him, her gaze sharp and filled with defiance. But there was a flicker of something else, fear. In that moment, Lucas realized that despite their differences, they shared something universal. They both fought to survive. The warrior's lips parted, but no words came out. Only a rasping breath, a plea for help without a sound. Lucas hesitated. His mission was clear, get back to the extraction point. But this was something different. He couldn't leave her here, abandoned in the dirt, alone and broken. You're not alone, Lucas whispered, more to himself than to her. He had no idea if she understood his words, but in that moment, it didn't matter. The storm was still coming, and he knew that time was running out. Lucas hoisted the alien warrior onto his shoulder, his muscles protesting with the strain. Every step he took felt like it might be his last, but he pushed forward. The cold wind bit at his exposed face, but he barely felt it. His focus was entirely on getting them both to safety. Somewhere ahead, a makeshift shelter was rumored to be intact. It was a long shot, but it was all he had. With each laborious step, the weight of responsibility pressed on his chest. He was carrying the weight of more than just one life now. As they made their way through the snow-covered landscape, Lucas could feel the warrior's body grow heavier in his arms. Her breaths were shallow, but she was holding on. He couldn't stop. Not now. He couldn't let her die out here. The harsh winds howled in the distance, and the snowflakes whipped against his armor like needles. He gritted his teeth, pushing through the storm. The world around him was a blur of white and gray, but all he could focus on was getting them both to safety. The pain in his legs was almost unbearable, but he didn't stop. Not for a second. They were almost there. The shelter loomed ahead, a small, half-collapsed building that would offer some protection from the elements. As Lucas reached the door, he collapsed against it, panting. His whole body screamed for rest, but he couldn't afford it. He kicked the door open with his foot and dragged the warrior inside, collapsing beside her. The warmth of the shelter was a welcome relief, and Lucas quickly began tending to her wounds. His fingers fumbled with the medical supplies, his mind racing. He had no idea if she would survive, but he wasn't going to let her die alone. As the storm raged outside, Lucas worked, determined to save this alien warrior who, against all odds, had become his responsibility. The battle was far from over, but for the first time in days, he allowed himself to believe that survival was possible for both of them. As the storm howled outside, Sergeant Lucas Stone sat next to the injured alien warrior, his mind racing as he assessed her condition. Her breathing was still shallow, her body trembling in the cold of the shelter. The snowstorm raged beyond the thin walls, but inside, it was a fragile haven from the deadly elements. The shelter's small heater hummed softly, the only sound besides the occasional crack of wind against the walls. Lucas's fingers worked swiftly, his training kicking in as he checked his medical supplies. The alien warrior's legs had been severed in the blast, and the damage was severe. Her body was covered in cuts and bruises, and she had lost a lot of blood. He cursed under his breath, frustrated by the limited resources at his disposal. He needed more, but all he had was a small first aid kit and his own determination. Despite the severity of the situation, a strange calm washed over him as he focused on what needed to be done. He had been in tough situations before, but this felt different. This time, it wasn't just about survival. It was about helping someone, an alien, a warrior who had been left for dead. "Stay with me," Lucas muttered under his breath, his voice barely above a whisper. His words were more for his own reassurance than for hers. The alien warrior, who had yet to give him her name, was still unconscious, but her chest rose and fell with each fragile breath. Lucas knew he had to act fast. There was no telling how long she had been without proper medical care, and he couldn't afford to waste any more time. He grabbed the bandages and began to wrap them around her wounds, his hands steady. Despite the adrenaline coursing through him, he knew he had to stabilize her before the shock set in. As he worked, his mind wandered back to the battle. The explosion that had torn through the battlefield had been massive, and he knew the alien forces were still out there, hunting down survivors. They would be looking for him. They would be looking for her. His gut tightened at the thought. He could only hope they were far enough from the front lines that he wouldn't be found. His thoughts were interrupted by a soft groan from the warrior. Lucas immediately stopped what he was doing and looked down at her. Her golden eyes flickered open, locking onto his with a mixture of confusion and fear. She looked like she was trying to say something, but no words came out. Her lips parted, and for a moment, Lucas thought she might be asking for help, but all that escaped was a rasping breath. "Easy now," Lucas said gently, placing a hand on her shoulder to steady her. "You're safe, for now. Just relax." The alien warrior blinked slowly, as if processing his words. Then, her gaze shifted to the makeshift bandages around her legs, her expression hardening. She tried to move, but the pain was too much, and she winced, gasping for breath. Lucas was about to say something when she spoke, her voice low and raspy but strong. Why help me?" The question caught him off guard. For a moment, he didn't know how to respond. Why help her? He could have just left her there, let her die. It would have been easier, safer. But that wasn't who he was. "Because it's the right thing to do," Lucas replied quietly. "You're not just some enemy. You're a person, and I'm not going to leave you out there to die." The warrior seemed to absorb his words, her golden eyes softening just slightly. She studied him for a long moment before finally speaking again. I am not your enemy." Her voice was filled with disbelief, as if she had trouble understanding the concept. "No," Lucas said firmly. "You're not. I'm not some cold-blooded killer. I'm a soldier, but that doesn't mean I can't help those who need it." There was a long pause. The wind outside howled louder now, but inside the shelter, the world felt still. The warrior's gaze softened, and Lucas could see the tension in her shoulders slowly release. "Thank you," she whispered, her voice barely audible. Lucas nodded, his lips tight as he continued to work, trying to stabilize her as best as he could. He wasn't sure what the future held for them, but he knew one thing for certain. They were in this together now. As the hours passed, the storm outside showed no signs of letting up. Lucas kept watch, his rifle close by, always on alert. He had no idea how long they would have to stay in the shelter, but he knew that every moment counted. He couldn't afford to be complacent, not with enemy forces still out there. The warrior, now somewhat stabilized, had fallen into a fitful sleep, her breathing more regular but still labored. Lucas sat next to her, his eyes constantly scanning the surroundings. He couldn't shake the feeling that they were being watched, that the enemy was closing in. The sound of distant gunfire echoed faintly through the storm, a reminder that the war was far from over. But in that moment, in that small shelter, Lucas found himself focused on something else. The warrior beside him, once an enemy, was now a partner. A bond had been formed between them, born out of necessity but strengthened by something deeper. It was a bond that would change the course of both their lives forever. As the storm outside continued to rage, Lucas sat vigil by the injured alien warrior, his eyes scanning the bleak landscape through a small crack in the shelter's wall. He could still hear the distant sounds of explosions and gunfire, remnants of the chaos that had torn through the battlefield not too long ago. The planet was still at war, and they were far from safe. The cold was biting, but the warmth inside the shelter, although weak, was enough to keep them alive for now. Lucas's thoughts kept returning to the warrior beside him. Her name was Xaela, he had learned during their brief exchanges, though the confusion in her eyes still made her seem distant, almost like she didn't believe he was real, or that she didn't understand why he had chosen to help her. The bandages were holding up, though not perfectly. She had lost a lot of blood, and Lucas was doing his best to keep her hydrated with the little water he had left. She was a warrior, but she was broken now, much like the world they had both found themselves in. He could feel the weight of his decision pressing down on him. He had chosen to stay and help, but that choice came with risks. The longer they stayed here, the more likely it was that the enemy would find them. His mind raced as he tried to formulate a plan, but the uncertainty of the situation was overwhelming. He had never been one to second-guess himself in battle, but this was different. The stakes were higher now. It wasn't just about survival anymore. It was about something else entirely. Xaela stirred, pulling him from his thoughts. Her eyes flickered open again, and this time, there was more clarity in them. Her voice, when it came, was weak but clear. "Why did you help me?" she asked, her words thick with disbelief. Lucas looked at her for a long moment before responding, his voice low and steady. "Because we're not so different, you and I. We're both soldiers in this war, both just trying to survive." Xaela blinked slowly, processing his words, her expression softening. "You think we're the same?" she whispered, almost as though the idea itself was foreign to her. Lucas nodded, his gaze unwavering. "In a way, yeah. You've got your people, your mission, just like I've got mine. But when it comes down to it, we're all just trying to make it out alive. We all have something worth fighting for." Xaela seemed to contemplate this for a moment, her golden eyes searching his face as though she was looking for the truth in his words. Finally, she nodded, slowly at first, as if the idea was slowly taking root in her mind. "I was not supposed to be like this," she murmured, her voice trembling slightly. "I was supposed to be strong, to fight for my people, to lead them to victory. But now," she trailed off, her gaze drifting to the remnants of her shattered legs. "Now I am nothing." Lucas's heart twisted at the pain in her voice. He had seen warriors break before, but something about Xaela's words hit him differently. She was no longer just a soldier. She was a leader who had lost everything, a survivor who had been abandoned by her own people. "You're not nothing," Lucas said, his voice firm but gentle. "You're here, and that means you still have a purpose. You don't have to fight the way you did before, but you can still fight. You can still survive." Xaela looked up at him then, her eyes searching his face, as if trying to understand the sincerity in his words. For a moment, neither of them spoke. The wind outside howled louder, shaking the shelter's walls, but inside, there was a rare stillness between them. Then, Xaela took a slow breath, her hand trembling as she reached out to touch his arm. "Thank you," she said softly, her voice barely above a whisper. Lucas nodded, though he couldn't help the feeling of unease that settled in his chest. He knew she was grateful, but he wasn't sure what he had done to earn her trust, to earn her respect. As he sat back, his mind wandered again, to the battle, to the war that still raged outside. He had come here for a mission, to gather intel, to help his team, but now, it was clear that this wasn't just about that anymore. He had a new responsibility. He couldn't leave her. Not now. Not after everything. As the night stretched on, Lucas continued to monitor their surroundings, his thoughts drifting to the future. The storm outside showed no signs of slowing, and the enemy could be closing in. They had no way of knowing how long they could stay hidden, how long the shelter would protect them. He glanced at Xaela, her eyes closed once more, her breath steady but shallow. The warrior had become a survivor, just like him. And in the silence of the storm, Lucas made a promise to himself. He wouldn't leave her behind. No matter what it took, he would make sure she survived. He would make sure they both survived. The night seemed to stretch on forever, the relentless howling of the storm outside the shelter barely muffled by the thin walls. Sergeant Lucas Stone sat on the cold floor, his back pressed against the shelter's rough concrete wall, eyes scanning the horizon through the small crack in the door. His mind was a whirlwind of thoughts, plans, contingencies, and most importantly, survival. The world outside was a war zone, the once bustling planet now a broken wasteland. He had no way of knowing if reinforcements were coming, or if he and Xaela would be left to face whatever came next alone. As his eyes flicked over to the alien warrior lying on the floor, still unconscious but stable, Lucas found himself wondering how long they could hold out. Xaela had already suffered so much, but she wasn't dead yet. She was still fighting, even if she didn't realize it. He had to give her that. His thoughts were interrupted by a quiet groan from Xaela. Lucas immediately stood, his reflexes sharp, his hand going instinctively to his rifle, but it wasn't needed. Xaela's eyes flickered open, and for the first time since the attack, they seemed more focused, more aware. "How are you feeling?" Lucas asked, his voice soft but steady. Xaela blinked at him, her golden eyes studying his face for a moment before she slowly raised her hand to touch the bandages on her legs, a grimace crossing her features. "Better," she rasped, her voice hoarse, "but I still feel weak." Lucas nodded, his expression softening. "You've been through a lot. You're going to need some time to heal." Xaela's gaze flickered to the storm outside, her lips tightening into a hard line. "Time," she said, almost bitterly, "that we may not have." Lucas didn't answer right away. She was right. Every passing minute felt like a gamble. The storm outside was unrelenting, and there was no telling when the enemy would come searching for them. But Lucas wasn't going to let fear dictate their fate. "We'll get through this," he said finally, more to reassure himself than her. "One step at a time." Xaela looked at him, her expression softening slightly. "And you'll stay? You won't leave me?" she asked, her voice small, vulnerable. For a moment, Lucas froze. The question, the uncertainty in her voice, made him realize just how much they had both changed in such a short time. Xaela, the fierce warrior who had once been part of a brutal invasion force, was now a broken survivor. He could see the fear in her eyes, the same fear he had seen in the eyes of countless soldiers who had been abandoned by their comrades. He didn't want to leave her either. He had no idea what the future held, but there was something in him, something deep inside, that refused to walk away from this. "I'm not going anywhere," Lucas said firmly. "Not unless you're ready to leave first." A small, weak smile tugged at the corner of Xaela's lips, but she didn't speak. She simply nodded, the faintest hint of trust beginning to build between them. As the night wore on, Lucas stayed by her side, keeping watch, checking their supplies, and trying to think of their next move. The storm outside raged on, and he knew they couldn't stay in the shelter forever. They needed to get to safety, but there was no clear way out. The world outside was still a war zone, and moving blindly through it was a death sentence. His thoughts were interrupted again, this time by a loud crack of thunder that shook the walls. Xaela tensed at the sound, her body going rigid, but Lucas immediately reassured her with a gentle touch. "It's just the storm," he said quietly. "We're safe for now." But his mind was already racing. The storm might have kept them hidden for the time being, but the longer they stayed in one place, the more likely they were to be discovered. The enemy would eventually find them. And when they did, Lucas knew it was unlikely they would be shown any mercy. The thought of the coming battle made his stomach twist. He had faced countless enemies before, but the idea of fighting for both his life and Xaela's was a new kind of pressure. He couldn't afford to lose her, not after everything they had been through. As the night stretched on, Lucas couldn't shake the feeling that something was closing in on them. He had to act, and he had to act fast. "We'll leave in the morning," he muttered to himself. "Head east, towards the mountains. If we can make it to the foothills, we'll have a better chance of finding shelter." Xaela's eyes flickered over to him, sensing his change in mood. "You think we can make it?" she asked, her voice low. Lucas met her gaze, his jaw clenched with determination. We don't have much choice. We're not going to survive here. Xaela didn't respond right away. Instead, she stared at him for a long moment, the flickering light from the shelter's heater casting shadows across her face. Finally, she nodded, though the doubt was still evident in her eyes. Then we go together, she said, her voice steady. We fight. Together. The words settled between them, a quiet promise that bound them in their shared struggle. Lucas knew that no matter what happened, no matter how hard the road ahead would be, he wouldn't face it alone. And that made all the difference. The first light of dawn broke through the storm, casting a faint, gray glow over the barren landscape outside the shelter. Sergeant Lucas Stone stood at the entrance, his rifle slung across his back, scanning the horizon. The storm had finally started to die down, but the wind still carried a biting chill. The mountains in the distance loomed like dark shadows, their peaks barely visible through the lingering fog. He turned back to Xaela, who had already begun to stir. Her wounds were still painful, but she was stronger than the day before. She had spent the night in silence, resting as best as she could, but Lucas knew she was ready to move. He had made up his mind. It was time to leave. He checked their supplies one last time. Water, a few ration packs, and a basic med kit. They didn't have much, but it was enough to get them started. Xaela had already dressed, her alien armor modified to fit her injured body. Despite her condition, there was something undeniably fierce about her. She was still a warrior, and Lucas could see the fire in her eyes as she looked at him. Are we really going to try it? Xaela's voice was rough, but there was no hesitation in her words. Lucas nodded. We have no choice. If we stay here, we'll be found eventually. We move now while we still have the cover of the storm. Xaela didn't argue. She simply adjusted her armor, her movements slow but deliberate. She had adapted quickly to the idea of fighting for survival, even without her legs intact. Lucas could see the shift in her. She wasn't just a soldier anymore. She was a survivor, and she was beginning to trust him. He grabbed the pack and slung it over his shoulder, turning to face her. Ready? He asked, his voice steady. Xaela met his gaze with a determined nod. Let's go. The two of them moved cautiously out of the shelter, their eyes scanning the desolate landscape for any signs of movement. The ground beneath them was uneven, with patches of ice and snow that made every step treacherous. The mountains loomed ahead, their jagged peaks still hidden by the fog. As they walked, the wind picked up again, biting at their exposed skin. Lucas kept his pace steady, making sure Xaela was able to keep up despite her injuries. She limped slightly, but she didn't slow down. It was clear she was in pain, but she refused to let it show. For a while, the only sounds were the crunch of their boots on the snow and the howling wind in the distance. Lucas kept his senses alert, his hand never far from his rifle. They had made it only a few miles when they came across the first sign of trouble. A distant sound, an engine, low and rumbling, echoed through the valley. Lucas immediately stopped, signaling to Xaela to do the same. He crouched low, scanning the horizon. The sound was getting closer, and the last thing they needed was to run into enemy patrols. Stay quiet, Lucas whispered, his eyes fixed on the path ahead. Xaela nodded, crouching beside him. She was no longer the proud alien warrior from before. Now, she was a partner, and they moved as one. The engine noise grew louder, and soon, the outline of a vehicle appeared on the ridge. It was a small, military-grade transport, its dark silhouette barely visible against the fading light. Lucas's heart raced. The vehicle was heading in their direction, and they had nowhere to hide. They had to think fast. Without a word, Lucas grabbed Xaela's arm, pulling her down into a nearby ditch. It wasn't much, but it would provide some cover. They crouched low, their breath shallow as the vehicle drew closer. Lucas's mind was racing. The last thing they needed was to be spotted. The vehicle moved past them, just yards away, its engine rumbling like a thunderstorm. They could hear the voices of the soldiers inside, but the vehicle didn't stop. The danger passed, but the relief was short-lived. Lucas knew they couldn't afford to stay in one place for too long. The enemy would return. He glanced over at Xaela, who was still breathing heavily, her eyes locked on the vehicle as it disappeared into the distance. We need to keep moving, he said quietly. Xaela nodded, and without another word, they continued their trek toward the mountains. Every step felt heavier now, the weight of the world pressing down on them both. As the day wore on, the wind began to pick up again, and the snow turned into a fine mist that stung their skin. But Lucas didn't stop. He couldn't afford to. They were so close to the mountains, to the only place that might offer them some protection. But the more they walked, the more Lucas realized that they were no longer just fighting for survival. They were fighting for something else entirely. There was something between them now, something unspoken, but undeniable. In that moment, as they climbed higher into the mountains, Lucas understood that whatever happened next, they were in this together. The mountains seemed to stretch on forever, but they had made it this far. And for the first time in a long time, Lucas felt a spark of hope. They might just make it after all. The wind howled through the narrow mountain pass, the icy air biting at Lucas and Xaela's skin as they pressed on. The snow beneath their feet crunched with each step, and the distant peaks loomed like silent, watchful sentinels. They had made it this far, but the journey ahead was far from certain. Every mile felt heavier, each step a reminder of how much they had already sacrificed just to stay alive. Lucas's eyes scanned the rugged terrain ahead, his thoughts running 1,000 miles a minute. The enemy patrol they had narrowly avoided earlier still haunted his mind. They couldn't afford another close call like that. They needed to find shelter soon, somewhere safe where they could regroup. Xaela's breathing was labored beside him, but she didn't complain. Despite the pain in her legs, despite the exhaustion, she kept up. It was clear to Lucas that she wasn't just surviving anymore. She was fighting for something, a reason to keep going, just like him. The further they climbed, the more exhausted they became, but they couldn't stop. Not yet. Lucas's instincts screamed that they needed to get to higher ground, to a position where they could see any potential threats coming. After hours of trekking, they reached a plateau. The winds had lessened here, and the snow was thinner, replaced by rocky ground that offered better footing. Lucas paused, his body aching as he looked around. There was no sign of any enemy forces, but he wasn't willing to take any chances. "We need to rest," Lucas said quietly, his voice carrying a mix of exhaustion and resolve. Xaela nodded, her face pale, but determined. She had grown quieter over the last few hours, the toll of their journey wearing on her more than she let on. She had been a warrior, a leader of her people, but now she was a mere survivor, clinging to whatever strength she had left. Lucas didn't need to say more. They had no fire to keep warm, no real comforts, just the bitter cold and the isolation of the mountains. They sat down against the rocks, their backs to the cold stone, their eyes scanning the horizon. Silence stretched between them, but it was a quiet that spoke volumes. The harshness of the world they now faced was something neither of them had ever truly prepared for. Lucas's mind wandered back to the moment they had first met. Xaela had been on the brink of death, a fierce warrior abandoned by her people, and yet, here she was, still alive, still fighting. He had made a choice to help her, and now it felt like that choice was all that kept him grounded. He couldn't afford to think of the past, of the mission he had been sent on, of anything other than the present. He had to keep her alive. He had to keep them both alive. "You know," Xaela's voice broke the silence, soft but steady. "I never thought I would be here." Lucas glanced at her, surprised by the quiet vulnerability in her words. She wasn't the same warrior who had been so full of pride and anger. She was someone new, someone broken, but also someone rebuilding. "None of us thought we'd end up here," Lucas replied, his voice low but understanding. "But here we are, and we're still breathing." Xaela turned her head slightly to look at him, her golden eyes reflecting the fading light of the day. "You don't have to do this," she said, her voice almost a whisper. "You don't have to keep me alive. I'm not worth the risk." Lucas shook his head, his eyes locking with hers. "You're worth it," he said firmly. "You're more than just a soldier, Xaela. You're a person. You matter." For a moment, neither of them spoke. The weight of his words hung in the air, and Xaela seemed to absorb them, her expression softening ever so slightly. But the silence didn't last long. The stillness of the moment was shattered by a sudden crackling sound in the distance, the unmistakable sound of something moving across the rocky terrain. Lucas's instincts kicked in immediately. His hand went to his rifle, his eyes scanning the landscape for any signs of danger. "Stay low," he whispered to Xaela. She nodded, her movements precise, despite the pain in her body. They crouched behind the rocks, eyes trained on the horizon. The sound grew louder, and Lucas's heart raced. It wasn't just the wind this time. Something, or someone, was coming. The crunch of boots on snow was unmistakable now, a rhythm that didn't belong to nature. Lucas's grip on his rifle tightened. They had to act fast. He quickly gestured for Xaela to move behind the next set of rocks. "Get ready," he muttered. Xaela's expression hardened. She might be injured, but she was still a fighter, still a warrior at heart. "We fight together," she said, her voice steady. They waited, the tension in the air palpable, their breaths held, as the sound of approaching footsteps grew closer. Lucas's mind raced, running through every possible scenario. They couldn't outrun whatever was coming, and they couldn't let themselves be discovered. But in that moment, he realized something important. Whatever happened next, they weren't just fighting for survival anymore. They were fighting for each other. And together, they might just have a chance. The sound of approaching footsteps grew louder, and Lucas's heart raced as he tightened his grip on his rifle, his mind racing through possible strategies. The wind had stopped momentarily, making the crunch of boots in the snow painfully clear. Whatever was out there, it was close, too close for comfort. He signaled to Xaela, motioning for her to stay low and silent, and then he carefully peered over the rock, scanning the terrain. The shadows of the mountains stretched long, and the fading light made it difficult to make out any figures. But he could hear the movement now. More than one set of footsteps, probably a patrol. The enemy was here, and they were getting closer. His pulse quickened, but his mind stayed calm, focusing on survival, focusing on Xaela. This was their moment to either escape or face a fight they couldn't afford to lose. With no cover between them and the approaching patrol, there was only one option left. "Get ready," Lucas whispered under his breath, his voice barely audible. Xaela, her expression a mask of determination, nodded without a word. They both knew what was at stake now. The footsteps grew closer, and Lucas could make out the dark outlines of soldiers in the distance, their figures moving in sync, scanning the area. It wasn't just a handful of soldiers. It was an entire squad, their armor glinting in the dim light, their weapons slung at their sides. Lucas cursed under his breath, realizing that they were outnumbered, but he wasn't about to give up. Not now. Not when they had come this far. "We move in 3, Lucas muttered, his voice barely a whisper. Xaela, her breath shallow with anticipation, gave a small nod. They were ready. 1, Lucas began, his voice steady. 2. He counted, feeling the tension build in the air. 3. With that, Lucas sprang into action, moving fast, his boots silent against the rocky ground as he pulled Xaela with him. They made their way around the rocks, staying low, their bodies pressing against the cold stone. The patrol had almost passed, and they were nearly in the clear. But just as they reached the next set of boulders, one of the soldiers turned, his eyes scanning the area. Lucas's heart skipped a beat, but his training kicked in, and without a second thought, he dove into the shadows, pulling Xaela with him. The soldier's gaze swept past them, but he didn't stop, and after a few moments, the patrol moved on. Lucas exhaled slowly, his body tense with the close call. They had made it, but just barely. That was too close, Xaela whispered, her voice a mixture of relief and concern. Lucas nodded, his eyes still locked on the retreating patrol. They couldn't afford to stay put for long. "We can't stay here," he said, his voice steady but urgent. "We keep moving. We're not safe yet." Xaela, despite her exhaustion, pushed herself up, her face hardening with resolve. "Lead the way," she said simply. They moved quickly, staying in the shadows, using the rocky terrain to their advantage. The patrol was far enough ahead now that they didn't have to worry about being spotted, but the threat of more soldiers was ever present. Lucas's mind was working quickly, calculating their best route, weighing their options. The mountains still loomed ahead, their peaks barely visible in the fading light. If they could reach the high ground, they might have a chance of seeing the enemy's movements, of finding a way out. They continued moving, the ground beneath them becoming steeper, the climb more difficult. Lucas's muscles burned with fatigue, but he didn't slow down. He couldn't afford to. Every step, every breath, was a fight to survive. The storm had subsided, but the cold was unrelenting, the chill cutting through their clothes. Xaela's movements were slower now, her body growing weaker with each passing hour, but she never stopped. Lucas kept a watchful eye on her, always ready to support her, to pull her forward if needed. As they reached a narrow ridge, Lucas paused, scanning the area below. The mountains spread out before them, vast and empty, but far off in the distance, he could see a faint glimmer of light. It was small, distant, but it was a sign of hope. It was a village, maybe a settlement, somewhere they could find shelter and food. But it was also a potential trap. The enemy could be there. It was a risk, but it was the only option they had left. There, Lucas said, pointing toward the distant light. We head for that village. It's our best chance. Xaela looked at the light for a long moment, her gaze unreadable, before she nodded. Then we go, she said quietly. Lucas led the way, pushing forward through the rough terrain, the weight of their journey pressing down on them with every step. The village was still hours away, but it felt like a lifetime. As they continued their trek through the mountains, Lucas couldn't shake the feeling that something was watching them, waiting. The war was far from over, but they were fighting for more than survival now. They were fighting for each other. And with each step, Lucas knew they were getting closer to whatever their future held, no matter how uncertain it might be. The hours stretched on as Lucas and Xaela continued their trek through the rugged terrain, the weight of exhaustion pulling at their limbs with each step. The sun had long since disappeared behind the mountains, leaving them in an eerie twilight, the faint glow of the distant village the only light they could rely on. The wind had died down, but the cold was still biting, seeping into their bones, making every movement feel like a battle. Lucas could feel the weight of his own fatigue pressing down on him, but his focus never wavered. He had promised Xaela that they would survive, and he wasn't about to let her down now. He glanced over at her, noting the way she moved, her steps slower than before, the grimace on her face as she pushed through the pain. She was stronger than she looked, but Lucas could see the toll the journey was taking on her. Despite everything, she was still fighting, still moving forward. It reminded him of why he had chosen to help her in the first place. Xaela was more than just an alien warrior. She was a symbol of resilience, of the strength that existed even in the face of impossible odds. They had come so far, and the thought of losing her now made his chest tighten. We're almost there, Lucas muttered, his voice low but steady, trying to offer her some comfort, though he knew the journey ahead would not be easy. Xaela nodded, though her expression remained hard, unreadable. She didn't say anything in response, but her eyes flicked briefly toward the distant light. They were getting closer, but it still felt like the village was miles away, the terrain growing steeper as they ascended the last stretch of the mountain. Lucas felt the cold wind return, its bite sharper now as they neared the top. He stopped for a moment, taking a breath and looking out over the valley below. The village was still visible in the distance, but now, Lucas noticed something else, movement. At first, he thought it was just the wind, but then he saw it again, shadows shifting along the edges of the village, too organized to be the result of nature. Someone was there. The hairs on the back of his neck stood on end. Stay low, he ordered, his voice barely a whisper. Xaela didn't hesitate, crouching beside him, her eyes narrowing as she followed his gaze. She had seen it too. More patrols, she asked, her voice low but laced with tension. Lucas didn't answer immediately. He didn't need to. The movement he had seen was too deliberate, too structured. It wasn't just random patrols. It looked like an organized force, and they were closing in on the village. We need to move, now, Lucas said, his voice urgent. If they're already there, we don't have much time. Xaela didn't argue. She knew, just like he did, that the longer they stayed exposed, the less chance they had of making it to safety. She pushed herself up, wincing as she shifted her weight, but she didn't let it slow her down. Together, they moved quickly, navigating the rocky terrain with as much speed as they could muster. The distant light of the village was their beacon, their only hope of survival, but the path to it was treacherous, and Lucas knew they couldn't afford to make any mistakes. They crept forward, taking cover behind rocks and boulders, keeping their movements as silent as possible. The enemy could be anywhere, and Lucas's heart pounded in his chest as they inched closer to the village. The last thing they needed was to walk right into an enemy stronghold. As they neared the village's outer edges, Lucas signaled for them to stop, his body tense with anticipation. He could hear voices now, low and muffled, just beyond the next ridge. He peered over the top, his eyes scanning the area. A group of soldiers, armed and alert, were patrolling the outskirts of the village. They hadn't noticed him and Xaela yet, but it wouldn't be long before they did. "We have to get inside," Lucas whispered, barely able to hear his own voice over the sound of his racing heartbeat. Xaela nodded in agreement. They had come this far, and the village was their last hope. They couldn't stop now. "On three," Lucas said, holding up his hand. 1, 2, 3. With that, they darted forward, using the cover of the rocks to shield them as they made a mad dash for the village. The soldiers were still a distance away, but the closer they got, the more Lucas could feel the tension building. They had no idea what waited for them on the other side of those walls, but they had no choice. As they crossed the final stretch, Lucas's mind raced. The village was almost within reach, but there was no turning back now. Whatever happened next, they had to be ready. They could hear the soldiers now, voices growing louder as they approached the ridge. Lucas motioned for Xaela to move faster, and together, they reached the edge of the village, slipping into the shadows just as the patrol passed by. They were inside, but the question remained, would they be safe here, or had they just walked into another trap? They slipped into the shadows of the village, the cold, biting air surrounding them as they crouched low behind a stack of crates. Lucas's heart was pounding in his chest, but he forced himself to remain still, watching the patrol pass just a few feet away. Their footsteps were heavy, the crunch of snow beneath their boots too loud, but they didn't seem to notice Lucas and Xaela hidden in the dark. The soldiers were focused on their route, their voices a mix of conversation and orders as they made their way farther into the village. "We're in," Lucas whispered under his breath, but his words felt hollow, as though the danger wasn't over. Xaela was breathing heavily beside him, her body still battered, but there was a sharpness to her gaze that Lucas couldn't ignore. She was ready to move, but he knew they couldn't rush this. They had no idea what awaited them inside the village, or if it was already compromised. "Where do we go from here?" Xaela's voice was low, strained, but there was no hesitation in it. Lucas scanned the area ahead, his eyes darting from one building to the next. The village appeared to be abandoned, but Lucas couldn't shake the feeling that they were being watched. The houses were dark, no lights flickered in any of the windows, and yet there was a lingering sense of activity in the air. "We head for the center," Lucas said quietly, pointing toward the heart of the village. "We need to find shelter, supplies, and get a better look at the situation. If this place is safe, we can rest here, plan our next move." Xaela nodded, and the two of them moved cautiously through the narrow alleyways between buildings, each step deliberate. The quiet was deafening, the stillness broken only by the occasional creak of wood or the sound of distant, muffled voices. They reached the center of the village after what felt like hours, but the closer they got, the more Lucas's sense of unease grew. The village was too quiet, too empty. It felt like a trap, like someone was waiting for them to make a mistake. They had entered a ghost town, but the question was it abandoned, or had the inhabitants simply disappeared? When they reached the central square, Lucas stopped, motioning for Xaela to follow his lead. The square was larger than he had expected, its cobblestone streets leading to what appeared to be a large building, its windows dark, its doors closed tight. Lucas glanced at Xaela, his expression serious. "Stay alert," he warned. "Something's off here. We need to get in and out as quickly as possible." Xaela's eyes flicked to the building ahead, her body tensing as she took in the surroundings. She had been in far worse places, but even she could feel the weight of the silence pressing in. "Agreed," she said simply. Together, they approached the building, their movements fluid, trained. But just as they reached the door, they heard something. Footsteps approaching from behind. Without a word, Lucas spun around, rifle raised, his instincts sharp. He didn't want to fight, didn't want to draw attention, but he knew they had no choice. The sound of boots crunching on the snow grew louder, and then a voice. "Hold it right there." Lucas froze. He turned slowly, his heart sinking as he saw two figures step into the dim light, their weapons drawn. They were human, but their uniforms were unfamiliar, dark, military-grade armor with insignia Lucas didn't recognize. These were no ordinary soldiers. The men were heavily armed, their faces covered by dark helmets, their eyes scanning Lucas and Xaela like predators circling prey. "What do we have here?" the soldier in front asked, his voice gruff and commanding. Lucas held his ground, his body tense, ready for whatever came next. He couldn't afford to make a mistake now. "We're just passing through," Lucas said calmly, his voice steady, though his mind raced. We need shelter. We're not looking for trouble. The soldier didn't flinch, didn't lower his weapon. Instead, he stepped forward, his posture shifting as he assessed Lucas. You're far from home, he said, his voice carrying an edge. This place isn't a haven for strangers. We don't want trouble, Xaela spoke up, her voice stronger than it had been in hours, but there was a dangerous undertone to her words. She stepped forward beside Lucas, her alien features now fully visible in the dim light. We're not your enemies, she said, her eyes narrowing. The soldier glanced at her, his expression unreadable. Funny, because you sure look like one. You should have stayed out of sight. Lucas's grip on his rifle tightened, but he kept his composure. He couldn't afford to escalate things. We're not here to fight, Lucas repeated, his tone insistent. The silence between them stretched long, both sides waiting for the other to make the first move. Then, without warning, the soldier lowered his rifle slightly, his expression changing. You'd better come with us, he said, his voice now more neutral. You're not the only ones who need shelter. But trust me, you don't want to go wandering around here without knowing who's in charge. Lucas exchanged a glance with Xaela, her face still hard but unreadable. She was calculating, just as he was. After a moment, he nodded. They had no choice but to follow the soldier. They were in a village they didn't know, surrounded by forces they couldn't understand. But as they followed the soldiers into the building, Lucas couldn't shake the feeling that they had just walked into something much bigger than they had anticipated, and the true danger was only beginning. The future, for better or worse, was unfolding before them.